What's up, everybody? Thanks for clicking this video. Thanks for tuning into my channel. My name is Simon Hill, Black American from Louisiana, coming to you live from Budapest, Hungary. Today is July 15th, 2024. The time is 8:58 p.m. where I'm at right now, and we are doing part 8. Part 8. No, that's part 9. Part 8. Part 8 of our reading of Is the Turk a White Man by Murat Ergin, published in 2018. You can pick up this book for the humble price of $30. Soft cover, hardcover, $151 on Amazon, and we are reacting to this book. In our last reading of this book, we finished up chapter 4, and now we're on chapter 5, if I remember right. Yes, chapter 5, and the title of this chapter, it's well, basically they're talking about this, right? In our last reading, we were talking about the Turks doing basically a lot of race science. So they were pulling out skulls, measuring skulls, trying to convince themselves in the Western elites, Western educational elites, that they were white people, that they shared the same sort of physiological structure that all white people have, and therefore they are a part of the white race and a part of modernity. And basically, there was this university that was created by the Ottomans, but then when the Ottomans fell apart, the Republicans were trying to co-opt this university into the new narrative of new history that they were creating for Turkey to build a sort of nationalism and unity amongst the people. And they basically ended up firing a lot of the Turkish intellectuals who did not want to go along with the race science and the plans that the Republicans had to try to create a sort of unifying Turkish identity under the umbrella of whiteness and modernity. And so they replaced them with academics who were coming basically from Germany, when Germany was kicking out a lot of its Jews because they were becoming Nazi at the time. And these Jewish intellectuals, not all of them were Jewish, but a lot of them were, they were somehow caught in the middle of this weird thing where, you know, they're a part of this nationalist project that's talking about there's a unique Turkish race and they are exceptional to others in human civilization, but at the same time they're allowed to have academic freedom and that sort of stuff. And they're viewed as European intellectuals while in Turkey. Meanwhile, in their home countries, they're reviled for being Jewish in and of themselves. So we're going to continue here with chapter 5. Hopefully we can finish it. We're on page 188 of this book. And by the way, if you need the hookup on books, let me know. Send me a comment. Put the comment under this video and I'll send you some. If you have a book that you suggest that we read for the Book React series, let me know in the comments as well. And I will be trying to cover as many books as I can. I want to try to hit at least 10 by the end of this year. So y'all let me know what y'all want me to read, what y'all want me to cover, and also send movie suggestions for me, movies to be reviewed by my wife and I for the series that we do on this channel as well. So let's continue. So, as an example of this clash of intentions between visitors and locals and its communicative consequences, I will briefly look at the work of the sinologist Wolfram Eberhard, born in 1908 and died in 1989. Though not Jewish himself, Eberhard left Germany in 1937 under intense pressure to support the Nazis and secured a 10-year contract to teach in Ankara until 1948. At the end of his contract, he found employment at University of California at Berkeley. The way Eberhard's anti-nationalist work was received among Turkish scholars portrays a vivid example of the incommensurability between the visitors and locals. When Eberhard attempted to study Chinese history from a less nationalistic, that is, less Chinese-centered point of view, Eberhard's anti-nationalist framework led him to oppose a common sinological assumption as to the autochthonous nature of Chinese culture. Basically, he was trying to study Chinese history, Chinese culture through the lens of objectivity. And at the time, the Turks were like, no, what did the Chinese race do? What did their culture do? And whatever they did, that is indicative of them as a race of people, right? So he didn't want to do that. So he argued that there were extensive relationships between the ancient Chinese and other groups. For Eberhard, Chinese civilization developed out of an interaction between influences from multiple sources. After citing 5 different components of this culture, including a Western one whose possessors were of Turkic stock, Eberhard maintained a cautious tone throughout the article, although he could not resist the temptation to locate the oldest culture that has as yet been clearly distinguished on Chinese soil as one derived from from the Western culture. In another article, Eberhard develops a similar case by showing the existence of many foreign, including Turkish, individuals in Chinese ruling families throughout ancient Chinese history. Eberhard's attempts to present a more complex view of national origin also led to him to refuse to identify various Central Asian people as Turks. A better approach for him would be identifying the ruling tribes as Turks, but acknowledging the existence of non-Turkish tribes in a loose political structure. Eberhard's caution to identify national groups in ancient past was subjected to reinterpretation. Amalgamating these views into a broad framework on the origins and superiority of Turkish civilizations in Central Asia, many local scholars took Eberhard's gestures against Chinese-centric arguments as proof of Turkish origins of Chinese civilization. This resulted in an interesting twist. Turkish scholars used his idea as evidence to claim that many Chinese achievements occurred because of Turkish involvement. In this sense, the idea of relationship that seems to be emphasized in Eberhard's work turned into one of Turkish influence and precedence among Republican scholars. Through reinterpretation, Eberhard's views were amalgamated into a broad discourse on the origins and precedents of Turkish and Chinese civilizations. For example, in a journal published by the Faculty of Arts at the University of Istanbul, based on linguistic similarities between Sumerian and Chinese languages, an article claimed that Turks were the ancient founders of Chinese civilization. Turkish scholars would have possibly made similar claims even without Eberhard's work. During the heyday of the Sun language theory, several attempts had already been done to establish the Turkish origins of the Chinese language and culture. However, Eberhard's scholarship provided scientific and technical credibility to a larger discourse of historical, racial, and linguistic origins. Some articles mentioned Eberhard's work as well as other Western scholars in passing as scientific reference. Others mildly criticized him for his hesitation to participate fully in the Turco-centric worldview. For example, a journal article tried to prove the Turkish origins of a tribe called Onguts, criticizing Eberhard for considering them as Mongols. As a result, Eberhard's intentionally anti-nationalistic arguments paradoxically provided popularity and legitimacy to a nationalist body of knowledge that insisted on the Turkish origins of Chinese civilization. This was, to a certain extent, a dangerous move given the Turkish scholar's sensitivity to be associated with the quote-unquote yellow race. But the lure of claiming credit for Chinese achievements proved to be too great. One should not conclude that Western scholars' participation in the Republican scholarly mobilization occurred exclusively through reinterpretation. Considering the precarious situation of scholars in exile, it is not surprising that they were often responsive to Turkish expectations. Eberhard, for example, did not hesitate to establish historical and racial links between Turkish past and present. Today, it is a fact that Turks and tribes related to Turks lived in the eastern parts of Central Asia in the 3rd millennium BC, and even in the Neolithic ages. These Turks, just like other tribes that belong to the Turkish race and the Turks who having migrated to Anatolia from other parts of Asia, live in Anatolia, are the ancestors of today's Turks. Investigating their history and culture means investigating Turkish history and culture, and this is a national duty. Two important points appear in the excerpt. First, Eberhard explicitly attempts to locate the research agenda in the Republican Historical Project with his references to the connections between ancient and contemporary Turks. The second crucial point is the careful avoidance to equate Turks and Chinese ethno-racially by emphasizing the idea that they have different ancient homelands. This made it possible for Republican scholars to argue that the superiority of Turks influenced the Chinese, while denying any biological relationship to a non-white race. Other scholars at the Faculty of Language and History Geography participated in local Turco-centric research in different degrees. Archaeology and prehistory played especially important Turkish not homeland, though you could switch it for homeland. As an eminent archaeologist of the period argued, researching the Anatolian past resembled opposing the enemy with its own weapon. Walter Rubin, as the Indologist invited to work in Ankara, was expected to fulfill a significant task, establishing connections between the Indian subcontinent and Central Asia. Indeed, in several articles, Rubin attempted to demonstrate similarities between shamanism, celebrated by Republican modernizers as the national religion of Central Asian Turks, and Buddhism. The goal in the Republican interest in India appears to be of offering a parallel, if not an alternative theory, which traced Aryan whiteness to the Indian subcontinent. Rubin was expected to pave the way in this affair by tracing the origins of Indian religious practices to Turkic peoples as opposed to Aryan influences. Rubin also focused on the links between oral traditions, especially the tales of India and Central Asia. The body of research, including his more technical work, helped increase the scientific legitimacy of the anthropometric project through direct adoption of reinterpretation. Sorry. For example, a review of one of Rubin's books starts with emphasizing the importance of studying Indian history for Turkish national culture. So it's interesting here because it reminds me a lot of like Nazis sending like their scientists to like the Himalayas to find like the ancient, Germanic people that inhabited that region, and also to India as well, which is why the Germans adopted the Nazi the swastika, which is of Hindu origin, because they related it to the ancient Aryans that they related to. So once again, the Turks were at the time were being like many white people at the time doing pseudo race science to try to prove that there was some correlation between race, modernity, civilization building, all that sort of stuff. So are Turkish people white? Are Turkish people white? Yes. Yes, they are, because they were participating in this weird race science at the time, or at least the intellectuals who were leading the country were trying to make sure that they could have some claim to whiteness by doing this weird racial science. Continuing here, two other emigre scholars in Ankara, Benno Landsberger and Hans Gustav Gotterbrock, worked on two ancient Anatolian civilizations, Sumerians and Hittites. For this reason, their work was critical for providing legitimacy for portraying Anatolia as an eternally Turkish land, and hence indirectly defending against Armenian, Kurdish, and Greek territorial claims. Landsberger, perhaps to the dismay of the Republican elite, did not unequivocally insist on the Turkish origins of Sumerians, but his published work, which included frequent linguistic comparisons between the Turkish and Sumerian languages, as well as glowing evaluations of the Sumerian cultural accomplishments, provided reinterpretive ammunition for anthropometric theories that trace Sumerian origins to Central Asian Turks. A public presentation organized by the ruling Republican People's Party soon after Turkey's takeover of Hatay in 1939 gives us a glimpse of the significance of Landsberger's work. The author of the presentation drew on Landsberger's lecture in the Second Historical Congress to argue that the ancient inhabitants of Hatay, a region in southeast Anatolia, contested between Syria and Turkey, were ethnic Turks. Strikingly enough, a more recent article makes the same points about the Turkish origins of Gutian's building, again on Landsberger's work. I really want to look up Gutian's building. What is Gutian's building? Is that a famous building that I'm unaware of? Gutian's building. If you know it, put it in the chat. Gutian's building. What is that? Okay, the Gutian people, also known by the derived exonyms Gutians or Gutians, were a people of the ancient Near East. Their homeland was known as Gutium Gutians. Okay. Yeah, and basically they inhabited the Middle East. Okay, never heard of this civilization. Okay, interesting. All right, the Turkish origin of Gutian's buildings, again on Landsberger's work. This should draw our attention to continuities of scholarship between otherwise 60-year apart historical period. Gutterbrock's publications and excavations to energize the anthropometric discourses despite the more detached and technical voice in his work. German sociologist Gerhard Kessler participated in the ethno-racial mobilization of the period by publishing articles on race theory and by establishing racial connections between Germany and Turkey in his search for Turkish blood in Germany. A foundational figure of comparative literature, Erich Auerbach, whose Mimesis, the Representation of Reality in Western Literature, completed in Istanbul in 1946, became a canonical text in the history and criticism of literature, seemed disturbed by the extent of the Republican government's nationalist modernization and the contradictions posed by its use of Western scholars as agents of Westernization. For Auerbach, the Republican modernizers ignored the fact that refugee scholars were in exile, fleeing the irrationalities of Western modernity. of Western modernity. Moreover, his escape from the devastation of German nationalism and his encounters with the burgeoning Turkish nationalism that he observed during his 11-year stay at the University of Istanbul between 1936 and 46 produced a stark contrast in Auerbach's eyes. In a letter to Walter Benjamin, Auerbach fleshed out his unease about the role of Western scholars in early Republican Turkey. Rejection of all existing Mohammedan cultural heritage, the establishment of a fantastic relation to a primal Turkish identity, technological modernization in the European sense, in order to triumph against a hated and yet admired Europe with its own weapons. Hence, the preference for European educated immigrants as teachers, from whom one can learn without threat of foreign propaganda. Result: nationalism in the extreme, accompanied by the simultaneous destruction of the historical national character. Profound. He's seeing through all the BS that they're talking about when they're creating this new fantastical Turkish identity of people who migrated from Central Asia and became superhuman, and they invented every civilization. He's writing like saying these guys are losing their minds. Okay, so having found himself in the center of a paradox between a new nation's ideology dedicated to constructing a modern Turkish identity with the latest European pedagogies and an ideology of European culture dedicated to preserving ideals of Western humanism against ravages of nationalism, Auerbach was painfully aware that the role of refugee scholars was to give credibility to the Turkish government's claims to modernize, while inventing and maintaining an ethno-racial Turkish essence. For Turkish reformers, the widespread European perception of ancient Greece as the cradle of Western civilization was a difficult pill to swallow. Modernization, in Turkish eyes, required adopting that legacy. However, the ethno-racial twist in Turkish modernity also made it possible to form a rivalry between Anatolia and Greece as true heirs of civilization. Similar to numerous other scholars whose work was considered to form a bridge between ancient civilizations and contemporary Turkish modernization. Auerbach, along with Leo Spitzer, an Austrian literary critic who spent 3 years in Istanbul before Auerbach's arrival, was not only invited to adopt the heritage of ancient Greece to Turkish modernization, but also lent support to the Turkish scholarship that claimed this heritage as Anatolian influenced, if not entirely Turkish. Within the early Republican context, in which modernity resonated with innate talents and historical roots rather than structural transformation, humanist scholars were caught between their anti-nationalist humanism and the use of their humanist teachings for the purposes of Turkish nationalism. As Auerbach put it in another letter to Benjamin, here all traditions have been thrown overboard in an attempt to build a thoroughly rationalized state that will be both European and extremely Turco-nationalistic. The whole process is being carried out with a fantastic and unearthly speed. Please remember, to everybody who's listening or reading this book, that the reason why the Turks went so hard with nationalism, according to Murat Ergin, is because, the Turks were sort of late to nationalism. The Ottoman Empire lasted, a decade and a half, I believe, into the 20th century. Meanwhile, many of the European nations got rid of their monarchies or, were slowly transitioning into their formal nation states at that time. So that's why the Turks were like going so hard on trying to rid themselves of everything that was tied to their cultural past, traditions, and history, and that sort of stuff. Very similar to what happened in Russia after their communist revolution. So continuing here. The cultural encounters between Turkish and European scholars abounded with the potential of an embryonic critique of Orientalism. The enthusiastic, albeit outlandish, claims made by the Turkish academic establishment of the period sought to undermine and, in fact, reverse Orientalist assumptions embedded in Western social science, proclaiming an ancient Central Asian Turkic culture as the cradle of European civilization and investing in the methods and discourse of contemporary scientific methods to do so could help shift the center of Western civilization to the east and consequently destabilize some of the taxonomic boundaries drawn between East and West. The Turkish elite's aversion toward imitation, the rejection of Ottoman modernity, and the insistence on autonomy could be seen as steps toward manufacturing an alternative modernity. The work of some of the emigre scholars certainly contributed to this aspect. Emily Apter argues that Stephen Runciman, employed at the University of Istanbul from 1942 to 1946, 1945 as professor of Byzantine history, anticipated many of Said's discussions in Orientalism of suppressed Muslim cultural influences in an essay demonstrating the Eastern origins of Western tropes and poetic devices. Runciman's ability to master a wide array of languages, including Turkish, Arabic, and Persian, and his willingness to use sources written in these languages contributed sorry, written in these sources, contributed, written in these sources, and his willingness to use sources written in these languages contributed to his multifaceted perspective. Another humanist scholar at the University of Istanbul, Leo Spitzer, showed signs of a paradigm of global cultural exchange in his embrace of Turkish as a subject of philological research together with Romanic languages. Despite this apparent success of the university reform in bringing together the needs of the Turkish government and emigre scholars, striking incongruences existed among the parties as to the meanings attributed to Turkey's place in the West and to modernization. Nevertheless, neither the Turkish nor the emigre scholars' ventures into the uncharted territory flourished sufficiently to foster a thorough critique of the Orientalist framework. Turkish attempts to create an alternative modernity from indigenous sources were hampered by the ethno-racial taxonomic emphasis of the project. The Republican elite strongly cultivated the idea that the capability to modernize was innate, of course, at the same time, insisting that the Turks naturally possessed that essential ability. The attention given to ethno-racial characteristics to be discovered in a timeless past reinforced instead of challenging the idea of immutable differences between East and West. The premises the premise of the scholarly mobilization was in effect reduced to an attempt to relocate the Turks on the other side of the dichotomy. For many other European scholars, Turkey represented an exotic haven uncontaminated with modernity. The memoirs of the economist Fritz Neumark, for example, contain several passages expressing the excitement about the exotic appearance of the covered bazaar in Istanbul, his previous wish to visit the country of exotic wrestlers, and his observations regarding the characteristic traits of Turks, such as their slowness and irrationality. Along the same lines, the eminent American philosopher John Dewey's observations in Turkey came to mind. Dewey describes his visit to Ankara as follows: by the side of men laboring with an activity which for the Orient is almost feverish, there are scores of men and women sitting idly in the sun, hardly sparing the energy even for gossip, gazing into immemorial vacancy with minds which appear as ancient and vacant. Admittedly, Dewey's observations in the East were not always as crude as the passage above seems to imply. However, it is important to note a hint of curiosity for the essence of Turks and the questions as to the fitness of their essence for complete Westernization in Western scholars' assessment of Turkish modernity. Barring instances of anti-Orientalist exchange, the majority of emigre scholars, while appreciating Turkish modernity, built their perceptions of Turkey along the lines of immutable differences. For many emigre scholars, modernization in Turkey was a curious phenomenon that confirmed the superiority of Western civilization, but was doomed to stay incomplete and segmented. In their evaluation of Turkish reforms, Western scholars quickly saw a patchy, incomplete modernization. This view sharply contrasted with Turkish perceptions. The Turkish Republican rhetoric of modernization as a complete civilizational transformation entailed changing not only institutions, but also the entire culture and lifestyle of the country. However, progressive reforms in the center by a French speaking, top hat wearing, ballroom dancing elite group took time to reach large segments of peasantry. Examining the responses of emigre scholars to the conditions in Turkey, it is hard to miss the explanatory power of a presumed Turkish mentality, nature, or spirit lurking behind the talk of science, institutional change, universal education, and cultural transformation. Frequent complaints about the conditions of the newly instituted university, its lack of qualified assistants, equipment, and library facilities served as a venue to discharge their frustrations with what the emigres described as the Turks' tendency to reduce the entire Western experience to a summation of its parts. An American mathematics professor Richard Karant, who visited Istanbul in 1933 to assess the new university, appears impressed with reform efforts, but still warns about the lack of facilities and criticizes Turkish ignorance in matters of cultural exchange. We have the impression that out of a certain ignorance, the Turks underestimate these problems and are of the opinion that merely adding a lineup of recognized scholars will be sufficient to start a new university. Employing a similar framework, Edward Said describes Auerbach's complaints about the lack of facilities in Turkish universities as Orientalist attempts to create the myth of the scholar in exile. Okay, so a lot I have to say right there. I gave a little chuckle to the part about the ballroom dancing, wine drinking elite, because the thing that I've learned from my wife when they're describing Ataturk and stuff like that, is that like Ataturk was known to love ballroom dancing and fine, elegant European wares and clothes and customs and stuff like that. But he was also the man of the people who understood Turkish culture and customs and appreciated that as well. So I laughed at that. And the funny thing here, you know, from my experiences being in Turkey, is that being in Istanbul, there are parts of it that look like a very modern city, right? Of course, it has a lot of Middle Eastern influence too, but in a lot of ways, Istanbul feels like more modern in some ways than like Budapest, for example, because in Budapest we don't have very tall skyscrapers and high rises and that sort of stuff, and you have many multi-level story buildings all over Istanbul and things like that. Now, this is a different time. Of course, this took place, close to like 100 years ago. So, of course, things have changed. But basically, what they're trying to say here in the text is like, the Westerners, once again, are still denigrating Turks, saying that, yeah, they're trying to modernize and isn't that cute, but they can't really get it because the Turks still in the back of their minds, they're still slow. Right, the Turks are still slow, according to the Western scholars who are going there, saying that there are some immutable differences. There are things that the Turks will never be able to accomplish because of implicitly what they're implying is that their race would not allow them to do it. All right, continuing here. So, Afet Inan and Eugene Pitard, personal interaction in search of anthropometric essences. In the previous chapter, we met Afet Inan, Ataturk's adopted daughter, who was one of the dominant personalities in the First Congress of History, and Eugene Pitard, the Swiss anthropologist who served as the honorary president of the Second Congress of History and commanded a great deal of respect among Turkish modernizers. We will now look at the interaction between Inan, a model of modern Republican woman, and Pitard, a respected Western scholar. If emigre scholars represent a major form of interaction between Western and local scholars, the story of Afet Inan and Pitard illustrates another significant channel of exchange and collaboration. Inan was neither the most internationally recognized nor the most groundbreaking scholar of her period. When we consider her domineering behavior in congresses, it appears that, as Ataturk's adopted daughter, she derived her authority directly from the founder of the Republic, especially when it came to scholarly matters regarding the origin and nature of Turkishness, which had significant implications for the modernization efforts of the period. In fact, Inan even identifies a particular mythical point in time when Ataturk delegates and entrusts the task of studying Turkish history to her. The story, narrated by Inan herself, took its place in the official lore of Turkish modernization and enlightenment in the 1930s. In 1928, in one of the French geography books, it was written that the Turkish race belonged to the yellow race and that, according to European mentality, it was a secondary human type. I showed it to him, Ataturk. Is this so? I asked. No, it cannot be. Let's occupy ourselves with it. You work on it, he said. Interesting. That's funny. That's funny. So his adopted daughter picks up a book and says, look, look, look. That's funny. Look, the white people think we're Chinese. They think that we're a step below them. And Ataturk was like, okay, okay, baby, you work on that. You work on that. You make sure they know we're white. Okay. Interesting. Continuing here. All right. When justifying her refusal to question the said geography book in her memoirs, Inan mentions Pitard's influence. Keeping the picture and information in the geography book in mind, I was looking around and noticing that they were not in agreement with reality. I also had bought Professor Pitard's Races and History at that time. Evidence in it did not correspond to this geography book either. So, I don't know. Are they saying that this did happen or didn't happen? I'm very confused. Okay, either way, continuing here. The brief passages above reveal three important points about the development of racial theories in early Republican Turkey. And Afet and affect Inan's role in it. First, the task of investigating Turkish history, race, and language, and disseminating a proud sense of Turkishness to international audiences were delegated to Inan directly by Ataturk. Behind the confidence and authority Inan commanded lie the power of Ataturk's appointment. Second, Inan's scholarly efforts to establish the whiteness of Turks was intricately linked with the type of self-referencing we encountered in other occasions. As examples, we need to remember Reshit Galit's invitation to take a look at one another as proof of Turks' whiteness, and Shevket Aziz Kansu's parade of a peasant family, both in the First Congress of History. While for Inan, scientific arguments were necessary to convince Western audiences, looking around a phrase we encounter in the quotes above was an effective to see the truth of the Republican racial, historical, and linguistic typologies. Third, Inan and many Republican scholars paid first and foremost to how Turkish friendly the arguments were when evaluating Western publications. Concerns with the soundness of data and methods, as well as the existence of alternative explanations, came secondary once a work of scholarship was established Turkish friendly. Interpretive liberties taken to stretch smaller arguments into fantastic Turcocentric claims were too tempting. Inan was only 20 years old when she received the duty of investigating Turkish history. She had sufficient power and authority by 1930 to give the opening speech to the Congress of Turkish Hearths and suggest a proposal to establish a separate committee to study Turkish history. A committee of investigating history, which would eventually evolve into the Turkish Historical Society, was established upon Inan's proposal. In the 1930s, Afet Inan contributed to the formulation of anthropometric theories considerably. She authored the central themes of Turkish history together with a committee of other scholars. The textbook had a major influence on the popularization of the Republican ideological framework. She was a major figure in all of the historical and linguistic congresses of the period. The government sent Inan abroad to participate in numerous anthropological conferences as one of the representatives of Turkish delegation. Inan functioned as one of the most relentless enforcers of the Republican ideology in academic meetings. Her opening speeches set the agenda. During the meetings, her presence played a significant role to watch and stop transgressions from the officially sanctioned line. In addition to acting as an academic on a mission, Inan was truly an influential ideologue of the regime. Starting her career as a teacher in a public high school, she published a textbook of civics in 1930, which the government adopted to teach its citizens about the Turkish nation and nationalism, the state, rights, and duties of citizens, liberty and solidarity, taxation, and military duty. Inan accepts that despite her sole authorship, large sections of the book consisted of Ataturk's ideas and writing style. This book, entitled Civics, was also an important turning point in the development of Inan's gender consciousness, for she started campaigning for universal suffrage after writing the textbook. After complaining to Ataturk that she would not teach in her class again until she had at least as much rights as male students, Inan started working on convincing the modernizers as to the necessity of introducing legal reforms for gender equality. Now, I don't know if Ataturk was married or not. I don't remember, but either way, this is very reminiscent of, like, once again, in America, our first ladies, the woman who's married to the president, often has like a ceremonial role where she advocates for some ideas. Sometimes they even publish books and try to affect policy change or social change in America. And recently, my wife and I went out to dinner to have pizza, and we were talking about the wife of the current Turkish president, Recep Tayyip Erdogan. His wife, Emine, published a book about traveling to Africa, right? And the book is, being heavily promoted and is being widely read and stuff like that. And it just makes me think that a lot of the times, men use women as spokeswomen, or mouthpieces for like ideas that are meant to make the regime look friendly, to make the regime look open-minded, to make the regime look worldly or socially conscious, and that sort of stuff. And that's what this is reminding me of as well. Like, you know, in a sense, Ataturk was sort of like busy building the nation and leading the nation. And so then he delegated the race science to his adopted daughter because maybe he saw this as something that soft power was better at handling. Continuing here. So, legal reforms for women's suffrage passed in 1930 for local elections and in 1933 for national elections. While Afet Inan's prominent location in the ruling circle helped her push for these reforms, it also led to her contentment with early achievements. Her and a handful of other women's appointment to important posts in the Republican Turkey signaled for Inan the end of the fight for gender inequality. In her speech at the Third Turkish Congress of Language in 1936, to thank the delegates for electing her to the presidential committee, Annan remarked, "This election was also a sign of the man-woman unity that the Turkish reform and the regime of Ataturks established." It's easy to detect a sense of looking around in this evaluation. While women of certain social class and background were acquiring governmental positions, there was a long road ahead for social equality between men and women. While showing her election as a success of the regime, it is also important to note that Inan used the term unity instead of equality between women and men. Republican nationalism placed serious limitations against any movement that requested an autonomous form of equality. Gender primarily mattered as far as it acted as a force contributing to the unity of the nation. Inan, ironically, played a part in the foundation of this restrictive sense of national unity and homogeneity. In her books of civics, the general description of nation highlighted psychological and cultural factors. However, the definition of the Turkish nation was much more detailed. In terms of its common characteristics, listed as unity in political entity, unity in language, unity in homeland, unity in race and origin, historical affinity, moral affinity, the Turkish nation, as the book boasted, exceeded all other nations because none of the others had the complete combination. In the 1930s, when Inan was in the early steps of the academic hierarchy, Eugene Pittard had already established himself as a respectable scholar. Pittard's anthropological work on race is more nuanced than its representation in Republican Turkey. His work tends to approach race and its influence on history and culture cautiously and ambivalently. On one hand, Pittard's work engaged with the anti-Orientalist promise of the Republican racial agendas. He was the face of the respected scholar who questioned Eurocentric racial classifications and showed openness to the contributions of other cultures. On the other hand, in categorizing skulls and bones in search of stables, essences, and boundaries of groups, Pittard's work stood for the gaze of objective Western science that it would testify for the racial superiority of Turks. Pittard enjoyed human diversity he observed in his time, yet he never stopped searching for purity in a timeless past. His Race and History, published in 1924, was not an entirely racial account of historical factors. In fact, Pittard criticized Gobineau in his book, insisting that his studies were more objective. While accepting that anthropological studies could be prone to errors. In Race and History, Pittard cautions against distinguishing between convergent characters and inherited characters. Despite his hesitations, Pittard's efforts at racial classification based on such characteristics as color of the skin, hair, color of eyes and hair, height, the cephalic index, and facial features proved useful for the taxonomic purpose of the Turkish elite. What was more appealing was Pittard's praising comments for the Turkish race and his classification of Turks into the brachycephalic category. The Turks are certainly one of the handsome faces of Eurasia. In the Balkan Peninsula, where one meets with many remarkable human types, the Turks are far from being relegated to the background. And we may say at once, having seen many Turks, that very few of them suggest that they and the Mongols could have had similar origin. In the early 1930s, Pittard developed a personal interest in Republican Turkey. In 1931, he published a flattering travel account of modern Turkey, introducing the new face of Turkey to foreigners. The book was soon translated into Turkish. In the early 1930s, he began exchanging letters with the Turkish elite. Pittard gradually developed a close personal relationship with and deep admiration for Ataturk. He noted that Ataturk's strong desire to know about the origins of the Turkish nation as much as possible encouraged the chief of the nation to develop an interest in ethnic and racial issues. In 1935, Pittard took the initiative to contact Afet Inan and other scholars in Turkey. His specific interest in Turkish history had already set him apart from other Western sources, particularly no, sorry, practically establishing his authority beyond critique. Inan started attending Pittard's courses at the University of Geneva in Switzerland in 1935. When the Faculty of Language and History Geography opened in 1936, Inan, a poster child of the new women of the new secular republic, gave the first lecture, upon Ataturk's insistence, to a large and prominent crowd, although she had just started her graduate studies then. In her lecture, Inan repeated the premises of the Turkish historical thesis and the associated claims regarding the superiority of the Turkish race and language. In the lecture, only one Western scholar was highlighted as an example of impartial scientists who investigated and approved of the thesis. My teacher, Pittard. After that, it was a race against time to train Inan so that she could start teaching at the faculty in Ankara. Inan attended Pittard's courses until 1937 and completed her dissertation under his direction in 1939. So are Turkish people white? Yes, because Afet Inan is getting white woman privilege. She's basically getting affirmative action. She's related to the top guy in charge in Turkey. They send her to a school in Switzerland and pretty quickly fast tracking her to try to make her a university professor to teach in Turkey. Oh, that's crazy. Affirmative action at work. Continuing here. So, during her studies, Inan developed an interest in conducting the ultimate research for examining the anthropological characteristics of Turkey's population. She had a single point to prove. In its various historical periods, this homeland has witnessed changes in its political form and differences in its name, but its racial characteristics always protected the Turkish essence. To understand this is the easiest thing for us. However, to make it known in the scientific world is our duty. Initially, Inan conducted a study of anthropometric measurements among 200 Turkish women and presented her findings at the 17th International Congress of Archaeology and Prehistoric Anthropology in 1937, also serving as the president of the Turkish committee attending the Congress. The project later acquired enormous dimensions for her dissertation, completed in 1939. Inan's dissertation study was based on an anthropological survey of 64,000 inhabitants in Anatolia. The goal was to reach a definitive summary of physical and racial characteristics of Turks. The thesis was published twice in Geneva in its French original, and later by the Turkish Historical Society in Turkish. In the preface to the Turkish version, Inan acknowledged that such a feat would not be possible without governmental support. She was definitely right about it. The anthropological survey that constituted the data for Inan's dissertation was done by the Institute of Archaeology in 1937. In order to government mobilization, in order to get government mobilization in support of Inan's dissertation, I will briefly look at the history of the Institute. The Center for Anthropological Research was established in 1925 as an institute under the Faculty of Medicine in Istanbul. Considering the fact that anthropometric research gained momentum only in the 1930s, the center represents a relatively early example of anthropological efforts in the Republican Turkey. Until 1930, the center was not involved in teaching, period. Okay, instead, the focus was on conducting and publishing research as well as supporting students to attend educational institutions abroad. The most prominent Turkish anthropologist, Şevket Aziz Kansu, was sent to Paris for graduate education in 1927. Kansu defended his dissertation entitled The Skull Morphologies of New Caledonians and African Negroes in 1929, and upon his return, started a career of teaching and research dedicated to proving the racial capabilities of the Turks. The center published a bilingual in French and Turkish scholarly journal for 11 years beginning in 1925, the Turkish Journal of Anthropology. The Turkish Journal of Anthropology. The committee of editors consisted entirely of Darülfünun professors. The content of the journal gives us a glimpse of the way in which race and anthropology were envisioned in the service of the nation. For example, in the first issue of the journal, an article explains the need for anthropological studies in Turkey as follows. Just as it is our right to fully claim our political space among the nations, it is our duty to institute the place that falls in our race among the groups and peoples of the world. I just want to make this very, very clear for anybody who's maybe confused or losing the plot. The purpose of reading this book is not to decide if Turkish people are white. Nobody cares if somebody identifies as white or not. That is of no consequence. The purpose here is to combat the narrative that a lot of people say that Turks never thought about race. Race doesn't matter in Turkey. There's no conception of this as whites or anything like that, and that is not unique to their nation. When all we see at the beginning of the Turkish Republic, they were obsessed. They were obsessed with trying to prove that they were white. They were obsessed with race science. They were obsessed with trying to create this narrative that the Turks were a specific, unique race of people that were the inventors of modernity and civilization, much like in the same pattern and matter and manner as the white Europeans were doing when they were talking about whiteness, saying that whites were the arbiters of civilization, everything like that. Right? So they were doing the same thing and also still trying to classify themselves as white. Let's not lose the plot here. Okay? So continuing here. The journal strictly followed this agenda not only by importing race science from Europe, but also by publishing original research investigating the racial characteristics of various groups in Turkish society. For example, a comprehensive study published across 3 issues attempted to compare the racial characteristics of Turks in Istanbul with minority groups, namely Greeks, Jews, Armenians, Levantines, and foreigners. The authors thanked the Republican Party for its support, indicating the government's explicit support for race science. Ain't that a shame? See, Turkey is just like America. The Republicans always up to no good. With the university reform in 1933, the center turned into an institute of anthropology affiliated with the Faculty of Science. In 1935, when the Faculty of Language and History Geography opened, the institute moved to Ankara. Teaching and research took place under the institutional aegis of the faculty. Additionally, the Institute of Anthropology participated in a multitude of excavations and collected a large body of prehistoric remains, including bones and skulls. In 1937, preparations for a great anthropological survey started. Cantu claims that the orders came directly from Ataturk. For this purpose, a committee of 23 researchers was trained for 9 days at the Institute under the direction of Kansu. These individuals, all of whom were government employees, consisted of military and civilian medical personnel, especially doctors and physical education teachers. The survey started in July 1937 and took 4 months to complete. The research team interviewed 64,000 individuals across Turkey and filled out data sheets for each individual respondent. The data sheets contained 10 demographic questions and 27 anthropometric measurements, adding up to more than 2 million records for the entire research project. Some of the anthropometric measurements in the form included various measures of the skull, jaws, eyes, nose, height, weight, as well as colors of the skin, eyes, and hair. The Anthropometric Survey of 1937 illustrates one of the clearest examples of the inclination to classify the inhabitants of the Anatolia Peninsula and reach a definitive description of Turkish racial identity. So they were hell bent on trying to prove they were whites. They were. This is something that not a lot of Turkish people know about, and not a lot of people that think about Turkey or the Middle East. But yes, this country was obsessed with race science. They were obsessed with trying to prove they were whites. It was a part of the government's official policy. Continuing here. It is possible to see the dominant themes of the entire era in this survey. A sense of imminent discovery about the Turkish selfhood that was concealed for centuries. The search for ancient essences in the scientific measurement of present-day bodies. The equation of quantifiable racial characteristics with identities, culture, and the ability to change, modernize. The efforts to tell the West using its own methods that we already know by looking around, and the right to claim our place among civilized nations. In this sense, the survey was the realization of a dream pursued since the early days of the Center for Anthropological Research. Eminent political and academic personalities of the period participated in the fulfillment of this taxonomic dream. In the end, it was Afet Inan, the student of Swiss professor Eugene Pitard, who was entrusted with the task of interpreting the data in the service of Turkishness. Inan's anthropological characteristics of Turkish people starts with a brief introduction by Pitard, in which he praises the extent and importance of the study and suggests comparing the anthropometric findings of the present study with skulls and bones recovered from excavations in Anatolia. While Pitard displays a sense of uncertainty in insisting on further research, he also adds his personal belief that the inhabitants of Turkey were the grandchildren of Anatolian inhabitants and prehistoric, protohistoric, and historical historical periods. Inan, however, does not show the slightest sense of uncertainty in her claims. In her introduction, she outlines the historical context within the anthropometric data were intended to fit. Repeating the basic premises of the Turkish historical thesis, Inan mentions migrations from Central Asia over Anatolia into Europe. Europe, Inan argues, based on Pittard's work, would have stayed a state of backward tribes, similar to Australia, without these migrations. The introductory chapter also reveals Inan's insistence that anthropological measurements would be useful not only for determining the racial roots of the nation, but also for classifying individuals in every aspect of life, such as factory work, the army, school, and sports, therefore ensuring productive use of human capital. This view connects anthropometrics to the biometric project as well. The majority the majority of the rest of the book consists of evidence presented in numerous tables and charts in support of the view that the racial characteristics of Anatolia remain the same despite political and cultural variations over time. The book also claims the existence of racial unity in Turkey. Inan's assertive enthusiasm and Petard's restrained support for the Republican racial project is a microcosm of the tensions embedded in the interactions between local and Western scholars, including emigres. The Republican modernizers' vexed relationship with race and modernity turned visitors into embodiments of the hated and admired West. The story that began in the late Ottoman period then continued into the Republican era with a significant change. The embryonic linkage between race and modernity that began in the 19th century became an integral part of Turkish identity in the interwar period. The defeat of Nazi Germany at the end of World War II marks the declining popularity of race and racism throughout the world. The effects in Turkey are dramatic too. The race talk of the 1930s comes to a screeching halt in the second half of the 1940s. After the single part of the regime ends as a result of free and popular elections in 1950, the race scholars of the previous period turned into different careers and they appeared to be silent, if not explicitly apologetic about their previous work. This does not mean, however, that race and its links with modernity vanished into thin air. The next chapter will discuss the ghosts of race in the third critical historical era, following the Ottoman and early Republican eras, contemporary Turkey. So, we've moved out of like the early to mid 20th century in the creation of the Republican Turkey, right? And to sum it all up, basically the Republican reformers who were, trying to create the new nation after the end of the Ottomans were obsessed with race science. They were, inviting foreign scholars, measuring skulls, sending their adopted daughters of the dear leader to Switzerland to write books about how the Turks are white, and basically saying, look around, look around. We've always been Turks. We've always been the same unitary people that have migrated from Central Asia and spread out all across the world, influenced all sorts of languages, cultures, and civilizations, and the world would be nothing without us. This was done a lot in response to the Europeans who were demonizing Turks, in a sense, by calling them the yellow man, saying that they were from one of the lesser races of humanity. And this reaction by the Turks is somewhat natural because in Black America, we have the same thing. We say we were kings and queens to make up for the fact that the white people say that we're basically animals and stuff like that. So there's one hand, I understand it, but then on the other hand, I'm sort of like critical of it because, at the same time, why would you try so hard to try to be like the people who literally tried to carve up your country, and then on the other hand are still denigrating you? Like these Western scholars were still going to Turkey and say that the Turks are still backwards. Their modernity experiment is, really cute, but it's never going to work because the Turks are naturally of a lesser race still, right? But anyway, I thought that was very interesting chapter. And let's start into chapter 6. Race in contemporary Turkey. This might be where it gets a bit more heated, a bit more closer in time, so we might be able to relate more. So, in a now classic article, Sheriff Mardin, born 1969, critiques views that consider Turkey in terms of a single and homogeneous essence. Few countries have been as frequently described in terms of national character as Turkey. Clearly, Mardin aims the critique against portrayals of Turkey in terms of monolithic character. Complexity of nuances is a luxury all too frequently conferred to the powerful players of the global system. However, one can read this sentence in a different way and ask why it is so common to think of Turkey in national terms. What makes race used as an analytical construct in many other settings appear so muted in the Turkish case? Previous chapters highlighted the role racial discourses played in late Ottoman and early Republican modernization. In the contemporary world, race has a particularly dirty connotation. Except for extreme groups, no one claims to be racist. This is a world where racism exists, but racists do not. This chapter will trace the legacy of racial discourses in Turkey's imperial and republican past and argue that the links with race and modernity are still intact. Not only do the racial ghosts of the past, but also the flow of contemporary global culture contribute to the formation of racial discourses in Turkey today. I really like this quote. This is a world where racism exists, but racists don't. Because if you are a black person or if you are any person pointing out racism, the person automatically will say, I am not racist. There is no racism in our country. Racism does exist, but it doesn't exist here within our borders. Continuing here. This chapter has two major goals. The first goal has to do with providing clarity to the concept of race and with thinking about how it would aid our understanding of contemporary Turkey. This would include examining its overlaps with and differences from related concepts such as ethnicity and nationalism. Part of the task of offering conceptual clarity to a complex word also involves paying attention to the specificities of the particular setting of Turkey, especially in terms of explicating the changing cultural uses of race. To describe the particular type of racial operation that is fascinated with skin color and other marks of appearance, that buries itself deep into the hidden quarters of everyday culture and life, but loosely associates itself with more outright institutional and state sponsored forms of discrimination. I will use the term chromatism. I hate how this guy, throughout this book, he says anthropometric, biometric, instead of just saying, bodily race science or historical, race science, stuff like that. But when he's talking about chromatism, he's going to be talking about institutional racism. Anyway, the second goal is to carry this theoretical discussion to the Turkish case. By drawing on media analysis and in-depth interviews with immigrants, I will delineate how race operates in contemporary cultural debates. The three extensions discussed in the introduction will guide this analysis. The first extension has to do with time. This book took temporal snapshots, two periods, the late Ottoman period and the early Republican Turkey. This chapter deals with the contemporary era. As much as racial conceptions transform substantially, their legacies keep haunting the contemporary period. Race in contemporary Turkey makes sense when we consider the formation of whiteness as one of the dominant tropes in the history of modernization. Although race today appears in more subdued ways, taking for granted chromatic ideas of originating from the past flow over into the cultural domain. The second extension has to do with space. Racial discourses in contemporary Turkey flow not only from the past, but also from the race talk of global popular culture. Racial conceptions travel to unusual settings, especially because the transplantation of a globalizing popular culture in diverse settings outside of their origins. As earlier chapters discussed how in late Ottoman and early Republican periods, racial discourses always maintained close interactions with the West, both as a conceptual entity and, as in the case of emigre scholars, as flesh and blood individuals moving across borders. Racial formations have always been globalized, but today the cultural flows are more extensive than ever. The third extension has to do with the theory. Anglo-American academic hegemony operates on the basis of a global division of labor. The center produces theory, whereas cases to extend and test these theories come from the margins. Building theoretical connections between racial vocabularies in Turkey and global critical race theory can challenge these hierarchies in the sense that the persistent presence of race in Turkey's modernization efforts has the potential for showing theoretical flows across cases. Only by paying attention to a multitude of cases in a truly global exchange of theoretical and empirical models can we account for the global interactions between racial discourses. Building a collection of cases that does not privilege the Anglo-American experience can illustrate transnational linkages while paying attention to racial discourses is understudied in understudied cases. In this sense, race theory needs to acknowledge local variations in racial debates. Despite its almost exclusive focus on North America, critical race theory offers an important tool to understand the conceptual autonomy and taken for granted nature of race and whiteness. Race, ethnicity, and nation. Race, ethnicity, and nation display different levels of circulation across the globe. In the United States, for example, nationalism is a dirty word associated with others, whereas patriotism is seen as the American way of loving one's country. Race and ethnicity, however, are integral parts of the public discourse. Those who use these terms in everyday life do not engage in definitional exercises. What does race mean? Or classificatory schemes. How is race different from an ethnicity? A consequence of the omnipresence of race is that it automatically is associated with blackness. As critical race scholars have been emphasizing for a while, race becomes associated with non whites in many settings, leaving whiteness as a taken for granted and unmarked category. Race turns out to be a burden assigned by the powerful, who possess an invisible whiteness and all its associated benefits, to the subordinates, who is associated with blackness. Turning our focus to Turkey, we notice a number of differences. First, one needs to recognize that race is as much assigned by others as it is self asserted. While scholars in North America and Europe were busily classifying the world's people into racial groups along evaluations of inferiority and superiority, segments of Ottoman and Republican modernizers were actively engaged in manufacturing white identities for the purpose of rejecting the inferior roles assigned to them and eagerly claiming their share of the modernity exclusively reserved for those who could establish their whiteness. Before whiteness could become taken for granted, it had to be aggressively sought after, negotiated, and claimed. Instead of race being a terrain where blackness is assigned and negotiated to others, the late Ottoman and early Republican scholarly mobilization gives us a case where whiteness is demanded and allocated. Racial classifications are never stable. David Rodiger shows us how Irish American workers, perceived as blacks in antebellum America, were made into white workers. Turkish modernizers strive to build a racial transformation that would erase the Western stamp of yellow race and paint the entire country white. The explicit project of seeking whiteness halted at the end of World War II, but the links between race and modernity carried the project into the cultural terrain. Internal racial others began to be acknowledged in the 1990s. Second, the country is frequently defined in terms of national character. While ethnicity is a concept popularly reserved for Kurds, race is mainly absent in public discussions. Just as the absence of nationalism in the U.S. context does not impede the relevance of concepts, the conspicuous absence of race in Turkey may hint at the way racial discourses have become a significant part of Turkish modernization. So basically, what he's trying to say there is like, it's interesting because he studied in America, so he knows our culture to some degree. He's saying, like, in America, nationalism is not something we really talk about. In fact, it's kind of shunned. And we associate nationalism with, like, the far right. Now, the Overton window is moving in America where nationalism, blatant, like, we're better than everybody else and F you, get out of our country, that sort of nationalism is coming back in vogue in America to some degree, right? But by and large, for a long time in American history, and at least up to the point when this book was written, at least 2018, I mean, we were in the Trump era, but whatever, right? Nationalism, by and large, in American history has been sort of kind of like shunned. You get what I'm saying? At least as far as modern American history. I know some scholar is going to come out and say, no, in the past, nationalism was a clean word. In fact, patriotism came into vogue in 1942. Whatever, whatever. I don't care. He's saying that the same thing applies to Turkey. They might not talk about race the same way in America we don't talk about nationalism, but it does pervade in the background, and it was a part of building the nationalist project. That's what he's trying to get at here. Okay, very interesting. So continuing here. However, it leaves the burden of definition on those who examine racial discourses. In the Turkish context, it is much more urgent to provide conceptual clarity to the concept of race when operating in a more global framework. The Anglo-American dominance in race scholarship turns the rest of the world into cases, while the source of theory is almost always in the US and UK. Resisting the hegemony, however, does not mean closing our eyes to the global circulation of race. In this sense, the twin perils of imposing a foreign framework of race versus clinging to the idea of uniqueness remains in the background. Given the variability of the concept of race across the globe, the task is to find the common ground that would enable us to recognize racial injustices while still maintaining conceptual clarity. In this section, I will address the definitional burden and discuss how race can be relevant for the Turkish experience. Race, ethnicity, and nation are processes that define belonging and shape encounters at individual and collective levels. As group processes, they are highly dependent on the formative characteristics and resources of the groups that cling to these identities, as well as on the context in which race, ethnicity, and nation based encounters take place. For this reason, a fundamental characteristic of race, ethnicity, and nation is change. Neither the groups caught in racial, ethnic, and national struggles, nor the setting in which these interactions take place remain the same. Given this difficulty, we need to start with the recognition that definitional enterprises will necessarily remain incomplete and in need of replenishment as groups and contexts undergo transformation. Despite the fluidity, racial, ethnic, and national associations have been very consistently powerful, despite predictions by earlier sociologists such as Max Weber and Robert E. Park of their eventual demise. This leaves us with a difficult conundrum. The fluidity of conceptual boundaries is frequently contradicted with the intensity of belonging and group boundaries. In order to account for the complexity, the following treatment of nation, ethnicity, and race will emphasize differences as well as overlaps. My goal is to identify patterns and constellations in an ever changing terrain. While race scholarship places a disproportionate emphasis on the Anglo American world, it is just the opposite for scholarship on nationalism. The immense literature on nationalism draws upon cases from diverse settings of the globe, although some of the classic works have accentuated the European experience to a greater extent. Nation and its related concepts have proven challenging in this burgeoning literature. As Benedict Anderson observes, it is hard to think of any political phenomenon which remains so puzzling and about which there is less analytical consensus. Nationalism is socially constructed and taken for granted, similar to race and ethnicity. As a form of collective belonging, nationalism significantly overlaps with ethnicity. The main difference is that national affiliations are imagined as a political phenomenon with sovereignty of a group of people in mind, whereas this is not usually the case with ethnicity. I don't know if I agree. It is easy to think of states as containers of ethnic and racial claims, but in a world where transnational movements gain ascendancy, identity claims frequently transgress national boundaries. For that reason, emphasizing the political nature of nationalism for definitional clarity should prevent us from paying attention to how national claims are made in cultural, ethnic, and racial terms and how they transcend political borders. It makes more sense to place nationalism and other categories of inequality, particularly race and ethnicity, into a close conversation. I believe he's pussyfooting around just talking about race and understanding it. I get your metaphor already for using nationalism to talk about, to make the comparison for Americans to understand this, right? But I understand your audience might not be Americans. It might be Turkish people, and this book just so happened to be translated in English. Just I think conflating, saying that ethnicity is not the case, it's not imagined. All ethnicity to some degree is imagined too. Like all these cultures, all these things are imagined as well. I think the only sort of true identity could be lingua ethnicity, if that is a word, right? Identifying with a language group. But saying I'm Hispanic, I'm Latino, I'm Russian, right? Those don't mean anything, really. These are all imagined, I would say. Anyway, continuing here. How are the concepts nation and race linked? On one set of on one set of the ties that bind race and nation is contingency. Particular historical configurations placed race and nation all too often side by side, cooperating toward similar goals. George Moss, for example, observes that racism was just one among several alternatives from which nationalism could choose, emphasizing the historical contingency behind the alliance between race and nation. From this more empirical point of view, the obvious historical suspect is colonialism and imperialism. A long history of colonialism and imperialism sets a feedback loop in which racial discourses bolster national campaigns of domination, which in turn justify claims of racial inferiority and superiority and lead to racial discrimination. Racial conceptions of race based discrimination acquired their distinctive formation as a result of the colonial encounters of large groups of people. In a racially segregated world system, racial signifiers operate as a critical tool for dominant states to establish and justify economic, cultural, and political domination. The links between race and nation are also conceptual. The idea of nation presupposes the existence of racialized others through which national belonging is imagined, authenticated, and reinforced. Counterposing the conceptual affinities between race and nation against their historical linkages should help one resist the temptation to identify only certain types of nationalisms, ethnic, non Western, or their nationalism. Capability of aligning with race. All right, I'm just going to read that again. Counterposing the conceptual affinities between race and nation against their historical linkages should help one resist the temptation to identify only certain types of nationalisms, capability of aligning with race. I need to blow my nose. I think I'm getting some allergies, baby. Pardon. All right, continuing here. Uh, in this sense, empirical connections between race and nation do not simply emerge in moments of aberration and madness. Race and nationalism is the rule, not the exception. Race can therefore present itself as a form of supranationalism, refiguring notions of national heritage and culture into more powerful and virulent ideas of national inheritance, the national body, national purity, and aesthetic ideals of national men and women. The blurry boundaries between race and nation, as well as other categories of inequality, have been highlighted by other scholars. Theorizing these links requires extending the scope of race beyond biological differences. Immutability is one of the ideas built into racial conceptions, imagined biologically or otherwise. For David Theo Goldberg, race serves to naturalize the groupings of it identifies in its own name, in articulating as natural ways of being in the world and the institutional structures in and through which such ways of being are expressed. Race both establishes and rationalizes the order of difference as a law of nature. This law may be of human and not merely biological nature. As such, group formation seems destined as eternal, fated, as unchanging and unchangeable. So this is something like basically we should understand about race like it's all made up. It's not actually real. And when people are labeled as a race as such, they are also trying to label that person as having characteristics, traits about them, things about them that they cannot change, right? You're Asian, so you have a big old penis, and you're black, so you must have a tiny, tiny penis. Exactly. Stuff like that, right? Continuing here. Similarly, for Catherine Manzo, the distinctions between race and other terms of group difference are not so clear cut. Manzo highlights the fact that nationalist distinctions between those who belong to the nation and those who do not take place at a larger level. Nationalism's dominant conceptual partners, she argues, are not simply nation and state. They are also race and alien. For without the racialized kind of alien, there can be no national kin. Nation and alien are relational terms, interdependent and inseparable in nationalist thought and practice. Manzo establishes theoretical connections between race and nation by placing them along a broad framework of sameness, difference, inclusion, exclusion, and self other. Nationalism is racial when it treats permanent differences, especially difference found within the borders of state territory, as alien, threatening, and a problem to be solved. The framed tolerance of Western societies is no exception, because that which must be tolerated has already been constructed as unfamiliar, foreign, and less developed. Liberal humanism has been practiced as well, but only when prospects for assimilation or integration are not threatened by numbers. Only then do once racialized minorities, who have been white as well as black, cease to be represented through metaphors of dirt, disease, evil, and plague. National inclusion is contingent upon racial sameness. Very, very interesting. I guess he's basically saying here, like, saying toleration, saying something has to be tolerated is saying that something is different. Instead of saying, I am a human, and so I do not need to be tolerated, I am automatically accepted and let into the group. Uh, that's important, right? If you're saying that, black people need to be tolerated, that what you're saying is that our existence in and of itself is some aberration, some other in some group. That's very interesting. I like that quote. Anyway, Manzo illustrates how racial consciousness lives in collective consciousness and how code words such as culture, assimilation, crime, or protecting the borders operates to signify race, even in the absence of the term. Gilroy makes a similar point about the British society. He shows that daily problems, such as those associated with the educational system, are invisibly connected to minorities and immigration. Thus, small acts constitute a system of racial exclusion without actually referring to race. The maintenance of a racial hegemony occurs within the institutional and discursive frameworks of nationalism and the nation state. Balibar Etienne Balibar describes racism's ardor for immutability based on its characteristic insistence on the insurmountability of cultural differences. Drawing attention to the links between race and nation, Balibar observes that it is so difficult to define nationalism because the concept never functions alone. Albert Memmi, too, employs a broad definition of racism, refusing simplistic views that reduce racism to individual prejudice. Memmi argues that racism is embedded in social relations and social structure and is empowered by its ability to define. Although difference is the principal notion around with the racist enterprise revolves. Around which the racist enterprise revolves. Memmi accepts that one becomes racist only with the deployment of a difference to denigrate the other, to the end of gaining privilege or benefit through that stigmatization. A point also made by Balabar makes the practical and discursive operation of racism possible under different settings. Racism doesn't limit itself to biology or economics or psychology or metaphysics. It attacks along many fronts and in many forms, deploying whatever is at hand and even what is not, inventing when the need arises. To function, it needs a focal point, a central factor, but it doesn't care what that might be. The color of one's skin, facial features, the fingers, one's character, or one's cultural tradition. Max Weber defines ethnic groups as those groups that entertain a subjective belief in their common descent. Weber's definition highlights origins and blood ties without losing sight of the fact that these criteria do not have to correspond to objective reality. Hence, ethnicity, similar to race, is socially constructed. Sociology has steered away from Weber's original definition that links ethnicity with constructed claims around an objective reality in the past. Instead, mainstream sociology, especially in teaching settings, defines ethnicity in terms of common culture in the present, reflected in keywords such as language, custom, and religion. However, contemporary notions of ethnicity cannot account for whiteness embedded in the experiences and histories of many ethnic immigrant groups. Cornell and Hartman outline how race and ethnicity overlap but differ at the same time. Race and ethnicity overlap because some groups can identify with both. Racial discourses frequently employ claims of common descent and shared ancestry. Given the overlaps and linkages between race and ethnicity, the differences between the two are subtle but real. Race operates along perceived physical differences, although these differences easily overflow into the cultural domain. Racial categories, except for whiteness, are generally assigned by others, whereas ethnic identifications tend to be self asserted. Race is associated with evaluations of inherent moral worth and always function in a constellation of power relations. This may not always be the case for ethnicity. The way I distinguish racial identities from other forms of identifications has to do with the three characteristic features. First, race is a mutable category that builds on the idea of immutability. The immense the immense ability to change helps racial discourses travel and into diverse settings under various guises. The particular meaning of race and the operation of racial inequalities will depend of the specific context of each setting, and these can be smaller or larger than national settings. Despite their mutability, racial discourses are fascinated with immutability. Whether physical or cultural, race invents insurmountable boundaries and persistent distinctions. Thus, immutability is the key to recognize racial conceptions when biological racism manifests itself in more concealed contemporary forms, as one can frequently observe in debates around the cultural differences of immigrant groups and the barriers against their integration. Race scholars will inexplicably tread a fine line between accounting for the ceaseless variability of racial discourses across different settings and identifying the logic of immutability that links them. Second, racial classification of inferiority and superiority shape life chances and opportunities of groups, although individuals, especially those in dominant groups, tend to be unaware of racial privilege. This is especially true for contemporary forms of racism in the cultural domain, which vehemently denies its own existence. The overflow of race into culture extends the impact of race from social to cultural inequalities. As much as race has great implications in terms of the distributions of resources, as in, for example, inequalities in employment, criminal justice, and citizenship status, substantive inequality rely on a collection of cultural justifications. In this sense, racial discourses provide cultural scripts as organizing patterns for societies. In creating categories of valuation and acceptability, racial discourses distinguish acceptable knowledge, behavior, and shape individual and collective self definitions. Finally, race is always implicated in power relationships, as, by definition, it is involved in hierarchical construction of categories. The idea of inferiority and superiority constitutes an essential component of racial identification. So that shouldn't be anything new to anybody who's thought seriously about race, white supremacy, the creation of race, abolition of race, anything of that. I feel like I don't need to summarize any of that. But yeah, race is a very interesting thing because it talks about the immutability of some characteristics. Some things cannot be changed, but race in and of itself can always be changed because new people can become white, new people can be considered black. And when I say new people, I'm talking about groups of people and civilizations such as the Turkish one, right? Or the people, such as Turkish people, can always be debated as being white, right? And that has its own function within the system in and of itself. Very, very interesting right here, but it shouldn't be new to anybody who takes this seriously. Blowing my nose. The grossest things I do are always in the book react series. The grossest things I do are always in the book react. All right. Anyway, shall I continue? All right. I'm going to keep on reading until about 10:30. 10:30, then we're going to pack it up. So it's about 13 more minutes. Let's go. So race in contemporary Turkey. It is now time to address two questions regarding the status of race in contemporary Turkey based on the previous conceptual observations. You know what? I kind of want to leave this to tomorrow because this is a good point to pick up. This is a good point to pick up because he's really talking about race in Turkey here. And we're almost done with the book. I figure I maybe only have two more parts of these if I read for about 2.5 more hours and two more live streams. We should be done. Should be done by Wednesday, hopefully. I'll pick this up tomorrow. Let's see. How many more pages we got in this book right here? We got a picture, a graphic, something? All right, race in contemporary Turkey. It's a long chapter. Let's see how many more we go. All right, then we're in the conclusion. Chapter 7, right? The conclusion. And that's it. So yeah, we're pretty much done. We're on the last chapter. Then we have the conclusion. The last page of this book, I believe, is 240. Last page of this book is 240. I know I could have went to the table of contents. I just don't want to lose my space where I was in this book. And I believe right now, more pictures of Turkish people. Hilarious. Okay. I'm going to pick up on this part. Immutability of Turkish identity. Let's see. All right. Hold up. Wait. Yeah, we're going to start here. So we're on page 211, right? Yeah, we might be able to finish this book in the next live stream. I think I could blow through chapter 6 in the conclusion in the next live stream. I might just, dedicate like a good 3-4 hours reading that and wrap this up here. I'm not like trying to rush through the book, but it has been a longer book. It is much longer than Cyber Racism by Jesse Daniels. Well, there's a lot of overlap here because both of these people are respected sociologists and they're doing their thing. They're talking about critical race theory, analyzing race through a critical perspective, acknowledging its existence, and giving very, very good information. I've learned quite a lot in this book. This was a very challenging book, but I've learned quite a lot in this book, and hopefully we'll be able to wrap this up in our next live stream. So y'all be easy out there. Thank you for watching. Simon Hill Keeps It Trill. Book React Part 8, Is the Turk a White Man by Murat Ergin. Tune in tomorrow for the next part of this live stream. Y'all be easy out there, and peace.